Please let me welcome Matt Oppenheimer via Zoom to the DN stage. So Matt, good to see you. Thank you for getting up at 6 a.m. in Seattle. One of our core ethos within DN, an area we emphasize, is backing mission-driven founders. From your experience, what does being mission-driven enable an entrepreneur to do and to remain motivated during tough times?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, well, first off, thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction, and thank you so much for having me. I've been to a few DN meetings like this over the years, and it's always a highlight of the year. I think in response to your question, Steve, I think, I started Remitly about 13 plus years ago. And I will tell you, as every entrepreneur in the room knows, there are highs, there are lows. Some of them are within the same 24-hour period in the early days of the journey. And I think being, having that foundation of being mission-driven is what has gotten me through a lot of those tough times. And I think it's also important to define what, at least I mean by mission-driven. And what I mean by it is solving a problem that really makes the world a better place. And I think a lot of companies, technology companies, may say mission-driven, but the problem they're solving is kind of, marginally beneficial to the world. And what I've felt since the day of starting Remitly that I saw in Kenya is that the, old way of sending money was expensive, it was inconvenient, it didn't treat customers with the respect that they deserve, and it was an underserved customer segment to where having that remittance be more affordable, more convenient, made a huge impact on their lives. And so I think first it has to start with authentic mission. And then the second is when that's there, it has fueled me through the darkest of days and toughest times.
Thanks, Matt. Thinking back to those first 6 months when we were working together at Remitly, and we're in one corridor, which was to the Philippines from the US, and we were just launching that second corridor to India. How did being mission-driven help you make choices that enabled that corridor to succeed when at first it looked very different than the Philippines corridor? And how did that experience help the mindset that now is the company up to 5,000 corridors?
Yeah. Well, I think, strategically, first I'll say thanks to DN for seeing what you saw in us back when we had 6 million in revenue, because not all investors saw that back then. The most common question was, hey, could we do this in the next market? And a lot of our competitors had gone really broad, had gone to hundreds of markets out of the gate. And we, being a Seattle-based company and Jeff Bezos being a personal investor back in the day, drew inspiration from Amazon. Audacious vision, focused, people forget, not only within e-commerce, but as a bookseller. And so I think that strategically there's an interesting lesson there that especially for big complex problems, whether it's e-commerce or international money transmission, being focused is, I think, critical, because companies ultimately succeed or fail if they run out of time, energy, or money. And I think that was critical to our success. So thanks for seeing that, because not everybody did. And I think the mission-driven component, it's an interesting one, actually, because the third market we did was Mexico. And we were actually going down the path of Mexico, which is a really underserved, really high-priced market, now one of our largest markets. But we pivoted to India, which is actually a more well-served market, already had lower costs, because we saw that the adoption curve was for digital remittances and having trust for digital remittances was further ahead in India than it was in Mexico, and Mexico needed some time to catch up to make that business viable. And so I think the interesting mission component, to answer your question, is I think we've balanced being mission-driven while also being, commercially driven.
In fact, on that point, both being originally a venture-backed company, but now as a public company, how do you as a CEO balance those trade-offs between being mission-driven and, of course, being performance-driven?
Yeah, I think, in my view it's a false dichotomy in the sense that a company can be both mission and performance driven. And while I gave that example of kind of how we prioritize, I think as long as entrepreneurs are focused a little bit more on the long term, then I think being mission driven and performance driven are one and the same.
So it's tough enough as a founder to be personally mission driven, as a CEO to be personally mission driven. how do you recruit and build a team that has that similar vision, and how do you build a mission-driven culture inside your organization?
Yeah, I could probably talk about the culture question for 20 minutes, and I'll be as brief as I can. But I do think that culture has been part of our secret sauce. And when I say culture has been part of our secret sauce, make no mistake, we have a lot of work to do on our culture, and we have a lot of work to become more mission-driven. I have a lot of work to become more mission-driven. But I think that defining culture, so you've got that as a North Star, starting with, and if you Google Remitly cultural values, you'll see a list of cultural values. There's only one at the top, that's customer centricity, and that's where mission lives and dies. I think everybody at Remitly knows that's why we're here, that's why we do what we do. And then we have a longer list of values that defines how we interact and how we get things done. And I think that the brief answer to that is defining it, and then integrating it into the interview process, the performance review process, and then I kind of call the magic is everything in between in an authentic way, not in a way that, chest thumping, we're amazing at all of these things, but giving folks feedback and selecting folks into the company that are customer centric, that do continuously improve, that are compassionate partners, that have a bias for action. I won't go through all of our values, but I think that you get a sense that that has been, I think, critical but authentic. We're not perfect. We have work to do every year to improve our culture and to become more mission-driven.
Great. Now, I want you to think back to before you went public. Private company, you have DN, you have DFJ, you have other great investors around the table. What can the investors do to support a mission-driven founder? What did you expect of us? What should an entrepreneur expect of their investor? How do they become a good supporter and sounding board for you as you think about driving a mission and a vision and a culture inside an organization?
Yeah, well, I think first it starts, I was just listening to the end of the Angel panel, which was fascinating. And I think first it starts with investing in problems that make a positive impact in the world. And I know that may sound cliche, may sound soft, but I really believe there are some problems out there that have a material impact in making the world a better place. I mean, $1.8 trillion in remittances are sent every year. It dwarfs things like, it's multiples larger than things like foreign aid. And when we started the industry, it was 8%. You do the math of the billions of dollars that we can put back in our customers' pockets on an annual basis. Those are the kind of problems. I just mentioned that as an example because there are many other examples that are that. And there are many other examples that are just like marginally beneficial to society and to the world. And so that's one is selection. And then once that selection is, and I think that if you find founders that really want to make that impact, they have the longevity and they have the stamina. That alone is not enough. But I do think it's a signal of potential success. And then what one can do, I think, help entrepreneurs. I mean, it's not any different than a non-mission driven founder, push in constructive ways, which Deanne has always done. I like being pushed. I put together my own development plan every year to try to improve and grow as a CEO, which I've needed to over the last 13 years. Ask the tough questions and be clear on what, once you've pushed, then empowering that entrepreneur to be able to make the right calls. Just like any good board and good governance would operate. Not all calls. Like there's governance in terms of setting the strategy, setting the budget, et cetera. But I will tell you, I walk into board meetings now and back when you were on our board, Steve, and it's intense. It's not like and that's what I think entrepreneurs need is tough, direct feedback, and then empowerment to take that feedback and then ultimately go and serve customers.
I want to give you your morning back in Seattle, and again, appreciate you getting up so early. One last question from my standpoint, and it's more general question. For all the budding unicorn CEOs out here, and we've got a packed room and standing room in the back, both in the DN portfolio and outside the portfolio, what general advice would you give to them?
Yeah, I would say there'd be advice around focus. I think that the bigger advice is I alluded to it at the beginning, especially in the early days of the entrepreneurial journey. It is really, really normal to go from like at 10 a.m. being like, I'm going to change the world. This is amazing. And then at 2 p.m. being like, we may fail tomorrow. Like this may not work. And I think what determines successful entrepreneurs to some extent, in addition to the mission component, is having the ability to stay level-headed through that, not let the highs go to your head, not let the lows crush you. And then throughout that journey, recognizing that tenacity is one of the most, I think, underappreciated skills, but it's tenacious about solving a problem, not tenacious about the solution. And that's this interesting balance where there has to be a lot of tenacity about the problem. Like we were trying to solve, and I, won't go into the early days, we had to make some pivots. And so how does one take that core skill of being a successful entrepreneur to be tenacious through the highs and especially the lows, while maintaining open-mindedness and flexibility to be pushed by your investors, pushed by your board, ultimately pushed by your customers to pivot and adjust the solution. And I think that's one of the key determinants of success. So that would be my advice, but the bigger advice is to know it's totally normal to have those highs and lows, especially in the Series Seed A, B stage. Everyone has gone through them on a daily basis, and recognize through that normality and through that tenacity, you'll be successful.
I really appreciate, first, your time today. Second, the economic returns we made working with you. Third, the fact that you've been a model by which we've tried to back other entrepreneurs and try to encourage them to think about changing the world for the better. So thank you again, and have a great rest of the morning in Seattle.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Thanks, everybody. See ya.